At approximately 9 a.m. on a calm and uneventful Sunday morning, a visibly shaken man identifying himself as Doctor Scott Sills made an urgent call to 911. His voice was filled with distress as he reported discovering a woman lying unconscious and unresponsive at the foot of a staircase. Following standard emergency protocol, the dispatcher instructed Dr. Sills to switch his phone to speaker mode so that he could be guided through immediate life-saving measures. Paramedics arrived within minutes. Despite their rapid response and professional efforts, they quickly assessed the situation and determined that Susan showed no signs of life. Suzanne Sills was born on July 30th, 1971, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Friends and teachers described her as diligent and fiercely intelligent, the type of student who not only earned top grades but also displayed a natural ability to lead and inspire others. She earned her MBA from a prestigious business school, where her professors quickly noted her sharp mind for finance and organizational strategy. Years before her marriage to Dr. Sills, Susan was in a different chapter of her life, navigating her first marriage while also confronting the emotional challenges of infertility. It was during this difficult period that she met Dr. Scott Sills, seeking expert medical help. What began as a doctor-patient relationship evolved into something far more personal. After finalizing her divorce, Susan and Scott married and embarked on building both a family and a business together. They poured their time, money, and passion into establishing a clinic dedicated to reproductive health and fertility treatments. Susan managed every non-medical aspect of the clinic with impressive precision: finance, marketing, human resources, and client outreach, while Scott focused on the clinical and scientific work. Their efforts quickly paid off. The clinic gained a glowing reputation for offering hope to couples who had nearly given up on having children of their own. Yet, as their clinic flourished and their public image gleamed, the reality behind closed doors became more complex. Over the years, those closest to Susan noticed a shift in her demeanor. Once bright and vivacious, she began to appear drained and less optimistic. Several friends and colleagues later reported that Susan sometimes confided in them about growing tensions at home. According to these accounts, she felt increasingly stifled in her marriage, describing her home life as emotionally difficult and tightly controlled. The spark that had once defined her relationship with Scott seemed to have faded into an atmosphere of tension and unspoken resentment. Then came the morning that would change everything. Around 9 a.m. on a quiet Sunday, a clearly distressed man identifying himself as Dr. Scott Sills placed a call to 911. His voice, while urgent, remained surprisingly steady as he informed the dispatcher that his wife had suffered a fall down a staircase in their home. He reported finding her unconscious and unresponsive at the base of the stairs. Following protocol, the dispatcher asked him to place the phone on speaker mode and began guiding him through basic life-saving procedures while emergency personnel were en route. When paramedics arrived shortly thereafter, they quickly determined that Susan was, tragically, beyond saving. Her condition suggested that she had been deceased for some time. One detail stood out. A cooking pot was found near her body, positioned unusually upright, as if it had not fallen naturally during a struggle or tumble, but had been placed with care or intent. This detail would later become a critical point of contention in the investigation. Scott offered an explanation that seemed both oddly specific and to some implausible. He told the responding officers that Susan had been preparing to walk the family dogs that morning, a task she performed routinely. According to him, she may have tripped on the stairs, fallen, and somehow become entangled in her scarf, suggesting that the dogs, possibly tugging on the scarf's ends, might have caused accidental suffocation. However, investigators were immediately skeptical. The story, while not impossible, seemed unlikely given the physical evidence and the state in which Susan was found. Detectives turned their attention to verifying Scott's account. The staircase in question stood over 13 feet tall. A fall from such a height could indeed cause serious injuries. But Susan was 45 years old, physically healthy, and known for her cautious and methodical nature. Friends and family were adamant that she was familiar with every corner of her home and would not have been careless, especially while descending the stairs she used daily. Further doubts emerged upon closer examination of the scene. The placement of certain items and the lack of chaotic evidence suggested that something was amiss. Adding to investigators' unease was Scott's demeanor. While he complied with law enforcement requests, allowing his home to be searched, submitting to DNA collection, and answering all questions, he remained notably composed. Simultaneously, a separate line of inquiry began, one focused on gathering insights from the couple's two children, 12-year-old twins, Eric and Mary Catherine. A detective sat down with them gently, aiming not to alarm, but to understand. The twins spoke of their mother's recurring migraines, describing how she occasionally retreated to Mary Catherine's room during these episodes to escape light and noise. On the previous night, Susan had experienced one of these painful attacks. She had taken a pot with her, a precaution in case she became nauseous, along with her usual pain medication. Both children described their household as generally peaceful, emphasizing the routine nature of their mother's migraines. They said that Susan had gone to rest early, leaving the master bedroom empty. Around midnight, Scott reportedly went to check on her, only to find her already asleep. Mary Catherine, knowing her mother would not want to be disturbed, decided to sleep in her parents' room instead. At approximately 4 a.m, the stillness of the suburban home was broken by raised voices coming from the master bedroom. Young Eric Sills, just 12 years old, was abruptly awakened by what appeared to be a heated exchange between his parents, Dr. Scott Sills and Susan Sills. His sister, Mary Catherine, also stirred from her sleep, alarmed by the intensity of the voices. When Mary Catherine hesitantly asked her father what had happened, Dr. Sills calmly reassured her that it was merely a small disagreement. Although Scott's explanation seemed simple enough on the surface, law enforcement officers investigating the events that followed found themselves with more questions than answers. During his official interview with detectives, Scott elaborated on the events of the early morning. He explained that when he went to check on Susan around 4 a.m., he found her hunched over her laptop. Despite battling a severe migraine, she was still absorbed in work, something he said was typical of her unrelenting drive. Concerned about her health, he claimed he urged her to rest and step away from the screen. But Susan, known for her resolve, allegedly refused to stop working, insisting that she needed to respond to several important emails. Their disagreement, though brief, apparently left both spouses frustrated. Eventually, Scott said, the matter settled and the family returned to bed. By 6:30 a.m., just 2.5 hours later, Scott suggested to Mary Catherine that they enjoy a refreshing morning swim in the backyard pool, something the family occasionally did together. Mary Catherine agreed, but what she saw when she left her parents' bedroom changed everything. There, at the base of the staircase, was her mother. Susan was unresponsive. A long scarf was wrapped around her neck, and a metal pot was lying nearby. Scott told investigators that the scarf had been used regularly by Susan during her migraine episodes. He said it helped her block out light and sound and had previously belonged to Mary Catherine. According to his theory, Susan had the scarf on as a form of comfort. The pot, he explained, was likely carried with her in case she became nauseous, as was often the case during her most painful migraine attacks. However, many aspects of the scene did not add up. Investigators began to express growing skepticism about Scott's narrative. As detectives examined the scene more closely, their doubts intensified. They noted that the scarf was tightly wrapped around Susan's neck in a manner inconsistent with accidental entanglement. The position of the pot also appeared unnatural, as though it had been set down intentionally, not dropped during a fall. Further complicating matters, Scott had visible injuries, a fresh laceration across his forehead and a significant bruise on his arm. When asked, he stated these were sustained during a car repair the previous afternoon. He even claimed that Eric had helped him in the garage. But when investigators asked Eric about this, the boy gave a different account. He remembered working with his father on the vehicle, but firmly stated that Scott had not hurt himself during their time together. This contradiction raised red flags for detectives, who were becoming increasingly concerned that Scott's story may not be entirely truthful. Another inconsistency emerged when Eric recalled seeing his mother placing the family's dogs into their crate the night before. This was unusual, especially considering her weakened condition. Why would Susan have planned to walk the dog so early in the morning, particularly while dealing with a migraine severe enough to force her into bed hours earlier? As investigators continued to comb through the home, forensic experts discovered biological material, possible DNA traces, inside the bedroom where Susan had gone to rest. The presence of these stains surprised the children, particularly Mary Catherine, who told police that the room had been completely clean when her mother entered it the night before. The finding didn't match with the tidy and quiet environment Susan had sought for relief from her pain. Despite the mounting circumstantial evidence, law enforcement was cautious. The material found in the room was suspicious but inconclusive. No arrest could be made without definitive proof of foul play. Instead, authorities continued collecting evidence, submitting everything, from the scarf to the pot, from Susan's laptop to her phone, for forensic testing. The preliminary medical examiner's report came just 4 days after the incident. Disappointingly, it offered no clear resolution. The findings were ambiguous and did not confirm the cause of Susan's passing beyond all doubt. A more in-depth toxicology screening, along with an analysis of tissue samples and trace materials, could take weeks, if not months. Investigators were determined not to rush to conclusions given the highly sensitive and complex nature of the case. In the meantime, law enforcement began focusing on mapping out Susan's social and professional life in greater detail. They reviewed her recent messages and calendar events, hoping to find context for her emotional state in the days leading up to the tragedy. Their goal was to understand whether stress from work or something more personal might have contributed to the events of that morning. Susan's professional circle was broad and included numerous physicians, administrators, and former patients. After speaking with several individuals, detectives eventually found a colleague who described Susan as increasingly anxious and withdrawn in recent months. This witness, who had worked with her on several cases, recalled Susan voicing concerns about personal control and balance within her marriage, details that seemed consistent with the picture her close friends had painted earlier. As for Dr. Scott Sills, those who knew him professionally described a different man, cheerful, accomplished, and always composed. His students at the university where he occasionally lectured remembered him as an energetic and kind teacher, someone with a bright future and an enviable resume. He had graduated from high school at the top of his class, completed a law degree, and then pivoted into medicine, where he specialized in reproductive health, a path that eventually led him to meet Susan. When news broke of Susan Sills' sudden and tragic passing, her friends, colleagues, and family were overwhelmed by grief. In those first few days, nearly everyone who knew her believed the incident to be nothing more than a heartbreaking and inexplicable accident, an unfortunate series of events that had led to a fatal fall. The initial shock swept through her personal and professional circles, silencing doubts and encouraging mourners to focus on her memory rather than the circumstances of her death. However, as detectives began their formal investigation and started interviewing witnesses, something unexpected occurred. Many individuals, friends, clinic staff, neighbors had already been in contact with her husband, Dr. Scott Sills. What they reported to investigators gave cause for concern. In their conversations with Scott, they noticed his stark refusal to speak about Susan's death. His reluctance to discuss even the most basic details of what had happened sent up red flags for those closest to the family. To them, it didn't appear to be the quiet mourning of a devastated spouse. It felt evasive. This behavior only amplified the suspicions of investigators. What had initially been treated as a potential domestic mishap was now quickly developing into what authorities believed could be a far more serious case. Based on inconsistencies, unusual behavior, and emerging details, detectives began to consider the strong possibility that Susan's death had not been an accident at all, but rather a deliberate act. As they delved further into Scott's statements, investigators noticed a troubling pattern. When speaking about his late wife, Scott often praised her business acumen. He referred to her as a capable co-founder and a smart manager, someone who was invaluable in operating their fertility clinic. But what struck many observers as strange was his complete avoidance of acknowledging her roles as a wife and mother. They spoke of her professionally, not personally, as if their shared life had been more of a corporate arrangement than a marriage built on love and family. Detectives began gathering statements from clinic staff to get a broader picture of Scott's behavior before and after the incident. One particularly observant nurse, who had long worked alongside the doctor, shared her observations. Before Susan's death, Scott had been, in her words, a rather average man in appearance. But within weeks of the tragedy, she noticed a startling transformation. He had undergone a hair transplant and was suddenly taking much more care in how he dressed and presented himself. His physical appearance was no longer an afterthought. He began posting regularly on social media, updating his profile pictures and frequently sharing personal updates. It didn't take long before he began a relationship with a new woman. To outsiders, it seemed that Scott had moved on with surprising speed, perhaps too quickly for a grieving widower. Though no one could fault someone for seeking companionship, the contrast between his behavior and the timeline raised eyebrows within the community and within law enforcement. Yet, despite this growing collection of red flags, the hard evidence needed to charge Scott remained elusive. The pieces were there, but none were sharp enough to cut through the uncertainty, at least not yet. In 2018, the case took a significant turn. After many months of meticulous laboratory work, the coroner's office completed an advanced forensic analysis of the DNA evidence found in Mary Catherine's bedroom, the place where Susan had reportedly gone to rest during her migraine. The results confirmed the presence of both Susan's and Scott's DNA. While not definitive proof of wrongdoing, it offered important confirmation that Scott had been physically close to Susan in the location where she was last seen alive. Then, on August 8, 2018, nearly 2 years after Susan's passing, detectives returned to the Sills family home. This time, their visit was not a routine follow-up, it was direct. One of the lead investigators looked Scott in the eyes and asked him the question that had loomed over the case for months: "Did you kill your wife?" Scott's reaction was immediate and telling. His demeanor changed. He grew visibly uncomfortable. Beads of sweat appeared on his brow, and he adopted a defensive posture. Still, he denied any involvement, maintaining that Susan's death had been a tragic accident. While police now felt confident that a crime had occurred, the burden of proof remained high. To build a prosecutable case, they needed more than instinct. They needed hard evidence. That's when they turned to Susan's digital devices, particularly her smartphone and laptop. Investigators believed that Susan, a meticulous and thoughtful woman, may have left behind some clues. Their hunch paid off. Within her messages and private notes, detectives found multiple instances in which Susan expressed deep dissatisfaction with her marriage. She had written that she no longer trusted her husband and was considering leaving him. Susan worried that her departure would threaten his financial stability and professional reputation. Further examination of Scott's own phone revealed something equally disturbing. Among his saved files was a screenshot of a photograph that investigators believed may have played a role in Susan's decision to leave. The image, dated August 30, 2016, carried personal significance, and its context, though not publicly disclosed, was described by authorities as potentially damaging to Scott's personal or professional life. Investigators believed that jealousy, combined with fear of public embarrassment or business loss, may have motivated Scott to act irrationally and violently. Adding to their concerns, police discovered that Scott had contacted a life insurance company the very next day after Susan's death. He had attempted to claim a $250,000 policy payout. The timing alone raised suspicions, and given that the circumstances of Susan's passing were still under investigation, the insurance company denied the claim due to potential foul play. Finally, on April the 25th, 2019, Over 2.5 years after Susan Sills was found lifeless at the base of her staircase, Dr. Scott Sills was formally arrested on suspicion of murder. At the time of his arrest, he was en route to perform a medical procedure. Authorities took him into custody, setting bail at $1 million, which Scott posted without delay. He was released pending trial. The long-awaited trial began in November 2023, 7 years after Susan's death. In court, Scott Sills' legal team presented an alternative theory of events. According to the defense, Susan had fallen down the stairs due to the disorienting effects of her migraine combined with medication. The house dogs, confused and excited by the commotion, had tugged on her scarf, unintentionally tightening it around neck. Unexpectedly, the deceased's daughter, Mary Catherine, spoke out in support of this version. Now 19 years old, Mary Catherine was no longer the young girl detectives had questioned on the morning of her mother's death. She had grown into a thoughtful and articulate young woman, and despite the tragedy that had shattered her family, she maintained a strong and steady relationship with her father, Dr. Scott Sills. As the trial entered its most crucial phase, Mary Catherine came forward, not as a witness for the prosecution, but in defense of the man now on trial for her mother's murder. According to her statement, on that fateful morning 7 years earlier, she did in fact witness something unusual. She remembered seeing the family's dogs playing near her mother, specifically pulling at the ends of the scarf Susan had wrapped around herself, something the girl hadn't understood at the time. The memory had remained dormant for years, buried in confusion. Mary Catherine explained that she never mentioned it to investigators during the original interviews because no one had asked her directly, and as a child, she hadn't realized the potential significance of what she had seen. Her voice shook in court as she explained, "I was only 12. I didn't know what mattered and what didn't. I didn't think it was important back then." She also noted a crucial detail regarding the scarf, one that aligned with the defense's timeline. When she and her father attempted to assist Susan before the paramedics arrived, they had removed the scarf from her neck while trying to perform first aid. That, she claimed, was why it was found at a distance from her body rather than tightly wrapped around her when emergency services entered the home. To support Mary Catherine's claims, the defense team commissioned a new forensic examination of the scarf. This time, DNA testing confirmed the presence of canine biological material on the fabric. Trace elements from the dogs, hair follicles and microscopic skin cells were found embedded in the weave of the material. The defense presented this as proof that the dogs had interacted with the scarf in a physical way, likely pulling on it just as Mary Catherine described. In addition, the toxicological analysis presented during the trial lent partial credibility to the theory that Susan may have suffered an accidental fall. According to the medical report, multiple medications were detected in her bloodstream, including a combination of painkillers and sedatives. These drugs had been prescribed for the treatment of her severe migraines. Furthermore, in the days leading up to her death, Susan had reportedly eaten very little and complained of constant fatigue. The defense argued that this physical frailty, combined with medication, may have caused disorientation, making a fall down the stairs more likely. Despite the new evidence, the prosecution remained steadfast. They called Mary Catherine's late revelations into question, suggesting her recollection might be shaped by loyalty to her father or by the passage of time. Prosecutors emphasized that while the scarf may have had traces of the dogs, the overall circumstances surrounding Susan's death still pointed to something far more intentional. One key argument put forward by the state involved the absence of physical evidence on the staircase. Experts testified that if Susan had actually fallen, there should have been biological traces, blood, tissue, or fibers on the staircase itself. But investigators found nothing. The staircase, with its 13 steps, showed no physical sign of a traumatic fall. According to the prosecution, this absence supported the theory that Susan had not fallen naturally, but was instead placed at the base of the stairs to stage an accident. Prosecutors also focused on the troubling position of Susan's body. During the initial emergency call, the 911 dispatcher had clearly instructed Scott to begin CPR on a flat, hard surface. standard procedure in any resuscitation attempt. Yet, when first responders arrived, Susan's leg was still resting on a step, and her position had not been moved. According to the prosecution, this strongly suggested that Scott had not genuinely attempted life-saving measures, but had instead posed her body to reinforce the narrative of an accidental fall. The state then returned to its central theory: motive. They argued that Scott was deeply unsettled by a photo Susan had shared publicly shortly before her death. This image, innocuous to outsiders, allegedly sparked feelings of jealousy and insecurity in Scott, emotions that festered and eventually exploded into a fatal confrontation. The prosecution emphasized that Susan had reportedly intended to leave Scott and take her share of the clinic with her. Text messages and journal entries recovered from her devices revealed that she felt emotionally stifled and financially strapped. The prosecution also questioned the credibility of the statements made by the couple's son, Eric. While Eric had earlier told investigators that his father had not sustained any injuries while they worked on the car together, the state argued that Eric could have been mistaken or even unconsciously influenced. After all, both Eric and Mary Catherine were young and traumatized at the time, making their observations susceptible to distortion. Scott Sills, throughout the trial, chose not to testify in his own defense, a decision that puzzled some and angered others. For 3 weeks, the courtroom was filled with conflicting narratives, emotional testimonies, and scientific evidence that offered as many questions as answers. When the closing arguments concluded, the courtroom fell silent as the jury was given their instructions. It took them only 3 hours of deliberation to return a verdict that would bring resolution to some and anguish to others. Dr. Scott Sills, 58 years old, was acquitted of first-degree murder, meaning the jury did not believe the crime had been planned in advance with clear premeditation. However, he was found guilty of second-degree murder, a charge that indicated the jury believed Susan's death had resulted from an intentional act, but without prior calculation. The sentence was handed down shortly after: life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 15 years.
On the morning of December 25th, 2010, Christmas Day, local police received a phone call. A couple had been out for a walk. As they strolled through the lightly wooded area, one of their dogs began to paw and dig at something beneath the fresh snowfall, clearly intrigued by what it had found. As they approached, the couple realized they had come across something deeply troubling and immediately notified police. Law enforcement responded promptly. Based on identifying features and evidence found at the scene, the authorities were able to confirm that the victim was Joanna Yeates. Joanna Claire Yeates came into the world on the 19th of April, 1985, in the tranquil and picturesque county of Hampshire, located in the south of England. She was born into a well-established and respected family, the second child of David and Teresa Yeates. Joanna grew up in an environment filled with love, warmth, and a strong emphasis on education and personal growth. Her parents both held prominent roles in the business world, occupying high-ranking managerial positions in reputable companies. Their successful careers provided the Yeates household with a stable and affluent lifestyle, allowing Joanna and her older brother, Christian, to benefit from opportunities that nurtured their academic and personal development from an early age. As a child, Joanna displayed a gentle demeanor and an inquisitive mind. She excelled in school, showing a particular aptitude for design and creative thinking. Teachers described her as bright, determined, and consistently kind to others. She pursued her education with purpose and later attended university, where she earned a degree in landscape architecture, an area that blended her passion for design, nature, and innovation. Joanna's ambition was not fueled by competition, but rather by a genuine desire to contribute meaningfully to the spaces people inhabit. Her vision was always rooted in harmony, beauty, and functionality. In 2008, a new chapter in Joanna's life began when she met Greg Reardon, a young, talented engineer working in the same industry. Greg, just 2 years her senior, was intelligent, driven, and shared many of Joanna's values and aspirations. The two met through mutual colleagues during a professional event and quickly formed a connection that blossomed into a romantic relationship. Within a matter of months, their bond deepened, and it became clear to both that they had found something special in each other. They decided to move in together the following year, choosing to build their relationship gradually and thoughtfully, without rushing into marriage. Their relationship was built on mutual respect, shared goals, and a deep emotional connection. Though they weren't officially married or engaged, Greg and Joanna were planning their future carefully. They discussed their dreams of home ownership and a meaningful wedding celebration, and were diligently saving money while advancing in their respective careers. In the autumn of 2010, an exciting opportunity arose that would alter the course of their lives. Joanna received a job offer from a highly regarded architectural and construction firm based in Bristol. The offer represented a significant step forward in her professional journey, and she accepted it enthusiastically. Greg, supportive as always, arranged for a transfer within his company to a Bristol branch, ensuring they could remain together as they transitioned to a new city. By mid-October of that year, the couple had settled into a modest but charming apartment on the ground floor of a well-maintained 2-story home located in a peaceful and family-friendly neighborhood of Bristol. The setting was serene and suburban, ideal for young professionals like themselves. The building's upper level was occupied by the landlord, Christopher Jeff, a retired teacher known around the neighborhood for his quiet demeanor and reclusive habits. Another young couple, also recent arrivals to the area, occupied the other ground floor unit adjacent to Joanna and Greg's. The couple quickly set about transforming their new living space into a welcoming home. They added personal touches, photographs, cozy furnishings, and holiday decorations that reflected their excitement about spending their first Christmas in their new home. It was a time of hopeful beginnings and holiday anticipation. On Friday, December 17, 2010, the calm routine of their life was unexpectedly disrupted. Greg had planned a weekend trip to Sheffield to visit his family and spend a few days with his parents before the holiday rush. Joanna, meanwhile, chose to stay in Bristol, intending to finish wrapping presents, prepare for Greg's return, and catch up with friends. She had mentioned her plans to meet colleagues for drinks after work to celebrate the approaching holidays and unwind after a busy week. That evening, Joanna followed through with her plans. She joined her friends at a nearby bar, where the atmosphere was festive and relaxed. Laughter echoed over the clinking of glasses, and conversations drifted between work topics and holiday excitement. Joanna appeared happy and engaged, enjoying the time spent with people she trusted. At approximately 8 p.m., she said her goodbyes, mentioning that she wanted to pick up something for dinner before heading home for the night. Surveillance footage from a local supermarket later confirmed that she stopped in to purchase a ready-made pizza and a couple of beverages, simple comforts for a quiet evening in. After completing her purchase, she exited the store alone and began making her way home. She called Greg around this time, telling him she had just left the store and would message him again before bed. That would be the last time anyone heard directly from her. Over the weekend, Greg tried several times to reach Joanna by phone and text. Though he grew increasingly uneasy, he initially assumed that signal issues or a low phone battery might be the cause of her silence. The area they lived in occasionally experienced reception problems, and Joanna had mentioned feeling tired. Perhaps she had simply turned in early or was preoccupied with errands. But by Sunday afternoon, Greg's concern turned into deep worry. He drove back to Bristol, arriving in the early evening. Upon entering their apartment, a wave of unease washed over him. The front door, which Joanna was always meticulous about locking, was ajar. Inside, the home was eerily quiet. Her handbag, keys, and wallet were in their usual places near the entrance. Her phone lay face down on the living room couch, its battery depleted but untouched since the last use. Their cat, normally lively and well cared for, appeared agitated and noticeably hungry, signs that it hadn't been fed in a couple of days. Joanna's shoes and winter coat remained by the door, suggesting she hadn't left the house after returning that night. Her car, too, was still parked in the driveway, unmoved. Nothing had been visibly disturbed, yet everything felt strangely off, as if time had paused the moment she walked through the door. Fearing something was genuinely wrong, Greg contacted several of Joanna's close friends and her parents. Each call confirmed his worst fears. No one had heard from her since Friday evening. With rising anxiety, he contacted the police and filed a missing person report. The investigation began swiftly. Authorities conducted a full search of the property, spoke with neighbors, and worked to establish a detailed timeline of Joanna's final known movements. They confirmed that she had been at work that Friday and had gone out with colleagues to a local bar afterward. Surveillance footage from the bar and the supermarket corroborated her movements up to a certain point. She had indeed purchased a meal and drinks shortly before heading home. Joanna Yeates is believed to have returned home sometime around 9 p.m. that Friday evening, following a cheerful gathering with friends and colleagues. Text message records later confirmed that shortly after arriving, she engaged in casual conversations with a few close friends, chatting about the upcoming Christmas party they had all been planning together. The tone of the messages was upbeat and lighthearted. There was no indication that anything was wrong or that Joanna felt uneasy. Inside the apartment, signs of her routine were immediately visible. The kitchen revealed a quiet domestic scene. The oven had been used, a pizza box was missing, a plate had been placed neatly on the counter, and 2 chilled bottles of beer sat waiting on the table. One of the bottles had been opened, though barely touched. Only a small amount had been consumed. It appeared that Joanna had been preparing for a simple, peaceful evening at home, likely intending to enjoy her dinner, relax, and perhaps watch a bit of television or continue wrapping holiday gifts. But something happened, something unexplainable, abrupt, and completely outside the normal rhythm of her life. The apartment showed no signs of chaos or disarray. There were no broken locks, no shattered glass, and no damage to suggest forced entry. There were also no obvious signs of a confrontation or physical disturbance. Her valuables, cash, bank cards, electronic devices, remained untouched and in their usual places. Based on this, investigators quickly ruled out robbery as a potential motive. A particularly curious detail drew their attention. Although the plate and cutlery had been set out, there was no trace of the pizza. It had been purchased according to the receipt, and the oven had clearly been used. Yet the packaging was not found in the trash, and no remnants of the meal were discovered in the home. It was as if that part of the evening had been interrupted before it could fully unfold. The napkin, utensils, and clean plate seemed frozen in time, mute evidence of a meal that never happened. Near the front door, Joanna's purse and keys had been placed as usual. Among the items on the small table was the receipt from the supermarket where she had stopped after leaving the bar. The timestamp confirmed she had bought the pizza and drinks at approximately 8:30 p.m., aligning with what her friends and Greg already knew. Authorities launched a formal search operation on Monday, December 20th. With each hour that passed, urgency grew. Joanna was not the type of person to disappear without informing anyone. Her family, friends, and partner all described her as reliable, responsible, and deeply considerate. For her to be missing, without communication, without reason, was completely out of character. Detectives carefully retraced her last known movements. They examined footage from traffic and security cameras between the supermarket and her residence. The recordings confirmed she had driven herself home, alone. There were no indications that anyone followed her vehicle, nor did she appear to make any unplanned stops. Investigators meticulously reviewed the footage, but found nothing overtly suspicious. Parallel to the search efforts, investigators began the process of interviewing people in Joanna's life, starting with those closest to her. As is standard protocol in missing person cases, special attention was given to her romantic partner. Greg Reardon, understandably devastated and anxious, fully cooperated with police. Given his proximity to the situation, he was initially treated as a person of interest, not because of suspicion, but because statistical data often points to someone close to the victim in such cases. Detectives needed to ensure they could confirm his whereabouts beyond all doubt. Greg had told authorities he had left for Sheffield that Friday evening to visit his parents for the weekend. This claim was supported by multiple verifiable details. He had worked a full day before departing for the drive north. Along the way, he had stopped at a service station along the motorway. The transaction was confirmed by a time-stamped receipt from approximately 9 p.m. Further confirmation came from his family. By 9:30 p.m., he had arrived at his parents' home. His presence there throughout the weekend was consistently corroborated by his relatives. Investigators conducted a thorough check and found no indication that he had returned to Bristol during that time. With his alibi confirmed, Greg was officially cleared from the list of suspects. 5 days passed with no sign of Joanna. As Christmas approached, the atmosphere around the case became more tense and heartbreaking. Her family remained in Bristol, clinging to hope, while volunteers distributed flyers and posters. The story received growing attention from the media, with news channels covering the case and encouraging members of the public to come forward with any information, no matter how minor it might seem. Then on the morning of December 25th, 2010, Christmas Day, a call was placed to local authorities that would shift the nature of the investigation entirely. A couple had been walking their 2 dogs along a quiet, snow-dusted trail near a wooded area in the Phelan district, approximately 3 miles from Joanna's apartment. One of their pets began to dig curiously at something beneath the fresh layer of snow. As they approached, the couple realized they had come across something deeply troubling and immediately notified police. Law enforcement responded promptly. When they arrived at the scene, they began a careful, methodical process to investigate what had been discovered. Based on identifying features and evidence found at the scene, the authorities were able to confirm that the victim was Joanna Yeates. With this discovery, the case evolved from a missing person inquiry to a criminal investigation focused on finding the responsible party. The priority for law enforcement shifted to locating and apprehending whoever had taken Joanna's life. Given the complexity of the case and the public attention it had garnered, experienced investigators from across the region, some with backgrounds in major crime investigations, were assigned to assist. A coordinated task force was established to explore every possible angle and to ensure that no detail would be overlooked. Media coverage intensified, but police remained cautious, choosing to release information strategically to avoid jeopardizing the investigation. They appealed to the public for tips and asked local residents to report anything unusual they may have noticed in the days around Joanna's disappearance. Despite interviews with neighbors, no one reported hearing strange sounds or seeing anything out of the ordinary. The lack of eyewitnesses complicated the search for answers, but investigators were determined. One area of particular interest was the building in which Joanna lived. As part of a routine canvassing of nearby residents, officers spoke with everyone in the surrounding apartments. It was during this process that they turned their attention to another tenant in the building, Vincent Tabak, a 32-year-old engineer who shared one of the ground floor units with his partner, 28-year-old Tanya. Tanya had spent that particular Friday night attending a corporate holiday celebration hosted by her employer. Vincent, Tanya's partner, stated that he had stayed home that night. According to him, he spent the evening resting and hadn't planned to leave the apartment until he received a call from Tanya asking for a ride. He picked her up around 2 a.m., several hours after Joanna was last seen. In his initial statement to the police, Vincent downplayed any connection to his neighbors. He claimed he barely knew Joanna or Greg, stating that while he had occasionally seen them in passing and exchanged brief pleasantries, there had never been any substantial interaction between them. Across the street from the building Joanna and Greg lived in, a separate gathering was also taking place. A group of young people had organized a house party that Friday night, inviting numerous friends to what became a lively event with loud music, laughter, and general commotion. According to several attendees interviewed by detectives, many of them had been drinking and were focused entirely on the party atmosphere, paying little attention to what was happening beyond the property. However, a few guests who stepped out onto the balcony around 9:30 p.m. to smoke recalled hearing something strange. While they couldn't agree on the exact nature of the sound, they collectively remembered hearing what seemed like a woman's scream. At the time, it hadn't stood out. It could have been anything, a loud conversation or even a prank. But in hindsight, that moment became an important timestamp in the timeline investigators were assembling. As detectives worked to identify everyone connected to Joanna's life and surroundings, one person naturally drew attention: Christopher Jeff, the 63-year-old landlord of the building. Jeff was a retired school teacher known to most of his tenants as a quiet and reclusive figure. He lived on the upper floor of the house and had owned the property for years. While neighbors described him as eccentric, there was nothing about him that had ever raised concerns prior to Joanna's disappearance. Nonetheless, as part of routine procedure, the police interviewed Jeff multiple times. During a second round of questioning, they noted a subtle shift in his demeanor. He seemed more uneasy and distracted than before, although he remained cooperative and willingly answered all their questions. Jeff stated that on the night in question, he had followed his usual schedule, attending a workout session at a local gym, which he frequented several times per week. According to him, he returned home around 9 p.m., locked his door, and went to bed not long afterward. He emphasized that he neither saw nor heard anything unusual that evening. However, when detectives asked for more detail, Jeff suddenly recalled something he hadn't mentioned in his previous interview. As he was walking home from the gym, he said he had noticed 3 young men loitering near the front of the house. He described them as unfamiliar, noting that he had never seen them in the area before. At the time, he hadn't given it much thought, but given the circumstances, he now considered it potentially relevant. Meanwhile, Vincent Tabak offered a slightly different timeline when asked to recall the events of that Friday. He told detectives that he had actually left the house twice that evening, once shortly after 9 p.m. to run a brief errand at a local shop, and again at around 2 a.m. to pick up Tanya from her company's party. According to Tabak, when he first stepped outside around 9 o'clock, he noticed that Jeff's vehicle was parked in the driveway in its usual position. But when he returned with Tanya several hours later, the vehicle was still in the driveway, only now it was parked facing the opposite direction. This subtle but telling detail suggested that Jeff's car had been moved during the period he claimed to have been asleep, contradicting his earlier statement to police. Adding another layer to the puzzle, Greg Reardon recalled a brief interaction he had with Jeff earlier that same day before leaving town for the weekend. Greg had informed Jeff that he would be away visiting family in Sheffield and mentioned, perhaps casually, perhaps with slight concern, that Joanna would be home alone for the next few days. This moment, in hindsight, carried far more weight. It meant Jeff was fully aware that Joanna would be by herself in the apartment that evening, a fact that led police to scrutinize his movements more closely. On December 30th, nearly 2 weeks after Joanna was last seen, Christopher Jeff was arrested. A full search of his apartment and personal belongings was conducted. Despite his visible discomfort during questioning, Jeff continued to assert his innocence and insisted that he had no knowledge of or involvement in what had happened to Joanna. During the search, officers collected several items of interest, including a pair of shoes with faint brown stains on them. These were sent to a laboratory for forensic testing. Investigators also collected a DNA sample from Jeff for comparison against evidence obtained during the post-discovery analysis of Joanna's clothing and belongings. After a detailed analysis, results revealed that the brown stains on the shoes were not blood or any other biologically significant material. They were, in fact, simple surface dirt. More importantly, the DNA sample from Jeff did not match any of the genetic traces found on Joanna. With no physical evidence connecting him to the crime, and after extensive investigation, Jeff was officially cleared as a suspect and released from custody. The focus of the case now shifted dramatically. With Jeff ruled out, detectives began looking more closely at Vincent Tabak, who until this point had been considered only a witness or peripheral figure. Unlike Jeff, Tabak's movements on the night in question weren't independently verified. Furthermore, certain details he had provided in his earlier statements did not hold up under closer scrutiny. Investigators began to notice that Tabak had subtly attempted to redirect attention toward Jeff on multiple occasions, often offering unsolicited theories about his landlord's behavior. Then came a more concerning observation. When Tabak was brought in for formal questioning, detectives noticed what appeared to be a series of small, faint scratches on the side of his neck, injuries that looked consistent with light defensive contact. When asked how he had sustained them, Tabak gave an explanation that was vague and unsatisfactory. He claimed they were from working around the house, but did not elaborate. When asked again about his neighbors, Tabak repeated his earlier claim that he didn't know them well. He maintained that he and Joanna had never interacted beyond a casual hello, and that their paths rarely crossed due to their respective schedules. The turning point came when detectives requested a DNA sample from Tabak for comparison, He became visibly uneasy, hesitating before responding. Eventually, he agreed to provide the sample, but with an unusual caveat. He stated that he may have inadvertently entered Greg and Joanna's apartment at some point when they weren't home. According to him, he had mistakenly wandered into the wrong unit while it was unoccupied. Despite initial resistance, authorities lawfully obtained a DNA sample from Vincent Tabak. The lab report revealed a partial match between Tabak's DNA and biological material recovered from Joanna Yeates' clothing. This revelation eliminated any lingering doubts about his status in the case. On January 11, 2011, law enforcement moved decisively. Tabak was placed under arrest and taken into custody for questioning. In addition to the DNA evidence, technicians identified microscopic fibers within the vehicle and in Tabak's apartment that matched the composition and coloration of the shirt Joanna had been wearing the night she disappeared. These threads further supported the theory that an encounter, far beyond accidental, had taken place between the two inside or near Tabak's environment. With this mounting body of evidence, prosecutors acted swiftly. 2 days after his arrest on January 13th, Vincent Tabak was formally charged with first-degree homicide. The charges were filed based on physical evidence, contradictions in his previous statements, and behavioral indicators noted during interviews. Over the following weeks, detectives constructed what they believed to be the true sequence of events. According to their theory, Vincent Tabak had developed a persistent and unhealthy fascination with Joanna Yeates. He had likely observed her patterns over time and may have been aware of her routines. On the morning of December 17th, when he overheard Greg Reardon mention to the landlord that he would be out of town for the weekend and that Joanna would be alone, Tabak may have seen an opportunity. Later that evening, once he saw Joanna return home, Tabak allegedly approached her under false pretenses, perhaps to ask for help, borrow something, or make casual conversation. Investigators believe he gained her trust momentarily, enough for her to let him inside. What happened next, they argue, was not an accident, but a deliberate and calculated assault. In October 2011, after months of pretrial proceedings and ongoing forensic analysis, Vincent Tabak's trial officially began. On October 28, 2011, the jury returned a verdict. Vincent Tabak was found guilty of first-degree homicide. The judge, citing the manipulative and calculated nature of the crime, issued a sentence of life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole only after serving a minimum of 20 years. On the morning of April 29, 2018, a fisherman was going about his usual routine along the banks of the Lane Cove River in Sydney, Australia. As he cast his line into the water, something unusual caught his eye. An object floating near the shoreline that didn't seem right. Concerned by what he saw, he quickly alerted the local authorities. Emergency services arrived shortly thereafter and began investigating the area. What they discovered was deeply disturbing. The tragic finding immediately prompted a full-scale criminal investigation. At first, investigators had no way of knowing the woman's identity. She had no identification on her. Later that same day, police began connecting the dots. They matched the woman's description to a recently filed missing person report and soon suspected that she might be Cecilia. Law enforcement officers reached out to Cecilia's relatives. Tragically, their worst fears were realized. It was Cecilia. Cecilia Bruna Hadad came into the world during the warm and vibrant months of fall in 1979. Born into a family that valued discipline, integrity, and education, Cecilia was raised in an environment that fostered intellectual growth and encouraged ambition. Even in early childhood, her teachers and neighbors recognized a spark in her that set her apart. She exhibited a maturity well beyond her years, a natural leader among her peers, and a meticulous planner who always kept her eye on the future. By the time she reached adolescence, Cecilia had already developed a clear vision for her life. While other teenagers navigated the turbulence of youth, Cecilia stood out for her laser-like focus and her unwavering sense of purpose. She spent hours immersed in books and research, often sacrificing leisure to pursue excellence. These early traits would later serve as the backbone of a promising career marked by determination and success. Upon completing her secondary education with outstanding academic results, Cecilia was admitted to the prestigious Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, one of the country's most respected and academically rigorous private institutions. There, she majored in business administration, a field perfectly suited to her analytical mind and strategic thinking. Her professors noted not only her academic brilliance, but also her interpersonal skills, which allowed her to lead group projects with ease and build valuable connections that would prove beneficial later in her life. After graduation, her transition into the professional world was seamless. She applied for a highly competitive position at a prominent multinational mining corporation headquartered in Brazil. After several intense interview rounds, Cecilia stood out among dozens of qualified applicants. In her new role, Cecilia thrived, quickly mastering company operations, understanding the nuances of the industry, and impressing senior management with her ability to deliver results under pressure. Within a single year, she was promoted to a leading specialist, a position that came with both prestige and significant responsibility. Yet Cecilia was not someone content with comfort or routine. She believed that growth required risk, and she was always seeking the next challenge. So when in 2007, at the age of just 27, an unexpected opportunity emerged, a job offers from a respected Australian mining firm, she did not hesitate for long. She embraced the challenge as a new chapter in her life story, one filled with possibility. Upon arriving in Australia, Cecilia was greeted not only by a new job, but also by an entirely different way of life. The climate, the language, the customs, everything was unfamiliar, yet invigorating. Despite being in a foreign land, she adapted quickly. Her role as a manager at one of Australia's largest mining corporations came with considerable expectations. But Cecilia proved to be more than capable. She quickly became known among her colleagues for her clear-headed decision-making, fairness, and strategic insights. Within a short period, she was fully integrated into the team, earning their trust and admiration. By 2016, having spent nearly a decade advancing her career in Australia, Cecilia took another ambitious step. She founded her own consulting company, an entrepreneurial venture designed to provide mentorship and guidance to those looking to start or expand their businesses. Her firm specialized in helping newcomers, particularly immigrants, navigate the complex Australian market. Her initiative quickly gained traction, and her reputation as a knowledgeable and empathetic advisor continued to grow. During this time, Cecilia also prioritized her family. She made it a personal mission to help her younger brother and sister join her in Australia. With her support, they were able to secure employment and begin building their own lives abroad. Professionally, Cecilia was flourishing. She had earned a second degree, expanded her network, and frequently traveled for business and leisure. Her social media reflected a life filled with accomplishments and memorable moments. However, her personal life remained more complicated. Despite her many achievements, romantic stability eluded her. Nonetheless, she remained hopeful and continued to believe that a meaningful and lasting relationship was still within reach. In the mid-2000s, during her early years in Sydney, Cecilia entered into a romantic relationship with a co-worker. Their bond quickly deepened, and in time, they decided to marry. For a while, things seemed promising. However, the marriage lasted less than 3 years. Though their relationship ended, it did so amicably. The pair parted ways without bitterness or legal disputes, choosing instead to maintain a cordial and respectful friendship. In 2016, shortly after her divorce, and as her consulting business was gaining momentum, Cecilia decided to return to Brazil for a brief visit. Her return was marked by joy and celebration. Those close to her were delighted to see how much she had achieved. On the third day of her stay, something unexpected happened. Cecilia ran into Mario, a former boyfriend she hadn't seen in nearly a decade. Their breakup years earlier had been amicable, but their lives had taken very different paths. While Cecilia had built a successful life abroad, Mario had remained in Brazil, facing various financial and personal setbacks. The encounter stirred up a mix of emotions. In the days that followed, the two rekindled their friendship, reminiscing about old times and visiting familiar places from their past. The connection between them seemed to reignite naturally. After returning to Australia, Cecilia and Mario continued to communicate daily through messages, calls, and video chats. The emotional bond deepened quickly. Within a month, Cecilia had arranged for Mario to come to Sydney, believing that their reunion was a second chance at happiness. Upon his arrival, Mario moved into Cecilia's spacious apartment, located in an upscale part of the city. At first, things seemed hopeful. Cecilia provided for him financially, helping him adjust to his new life. She went so far as to use her business network to help him find a well-paying job. Ever supportive, she encouraged his career development and took great pride in watching him begin to find his footing in a new country. However, as time passed, the relationship began to shift. Mario, once grateful and cooperative, started expressing dissatisfaction with his job and developed an interest in Cecilia's business. He increasingly wanted to be involved in her work, despite lacking the necessary experience. Tensions began to rise as he questioned her decisions and asked for a share in the company. Their arguments became more frequent and emotionally taxing. Cecilia, always diplomatic, tried her best to de-escalate the situation, but the pressure continued to mount. Mario began exhibiting controlling behavior, such as taking her phone without asking and accessing her work laptop. He started to isolate her from close friends and coworkers, making it difficult for her to maintain a healthy support system. Despite her efforts to maintain peace, Cecilia found herself emotionally exhausted. She had invested so much in helping Mario, yet the relationship no longer brought her happiness or stability. After nearly a year of trying to salvage the partnership, she came to a difficult but necessary decision. She sat down with Mario for a calm and honest conversation, explaining that she could no longer continue the relationship under the current circumstances. This final conversation proved to be a turning point, though not in the way anyone had hoped. When Cecilia calmly told Mario that their relationship was over and that she no longer wished to have any contact with him, his reaction was intense and deeply unsettling. Rather than accepting her decision with maturity or respect, Mario erupted in a storm of emotions. The news of their separation wasn't just painful for him, it shattered a fantasy he had refused to let go of. This was the last straw in a long series of emotional highs and lows between them. Cecilia, having reached her emotional limit, asked him to leave her home immediately. It was not a dramatic moment filled with raised voices or emotional pleas, just a firm and resolute decision from a woman determined to take back control of her life. At first, Mario appeared shaken. He tried to plead with her, repeatedly sending heartfelt messages full of apologies, declarations of love, and promises to change. But Cecilia stood her ground. She had come to understand, after many months of emotional distress, that words were no longer enough. Realizing that the situation wasn't going to unfold the way he had hoped, Mario shifted his approach. His once romantic messages gradually turned into manipulative ones, messages laced with guilt, subtle pressure, and eventually overt threats. Soon after, his behavior escalated from verbal intimidation to something far more troubling: persistent stalking. Cecilia began to notice his presence in places he had no reason to be: outside her office, near her apartment, and even at locations she visited only occasionally. The situation came to a head one night in January 2018. It was late, and Cecilia had just returned home from a long day of work when she heard a knock at the door. To her shock, it was Mario. She hesitated, initially refusing to open the door, but he continued knocking insistently. His voice, though low, carried a tone that made her uneasy. Eventually, without her consent, he forced his way inside. His actions were erratic and frightening. Inside the apartment, the situation grew even more alarming. An argument quickly escalated, and Mario's behavior became unpredictable. Despite being physically smaller and emotionally drained, Cecilia's instincts kicked in. She managed to escape his immediate reach and locked herself in another room, using whatever she could to barricade the door. From behind the door, she begged him to calm down, to think rationally, to leave and never come back. It was only when she threatened to involve law enforcement that he finally relented and left the apartment. In the aftermath, Cecilia was shaken, but despite the severity of the incident, she chose not to report it to the authorities. Perhaps she hoped that it had been a one-time outburst. Perhaps she feared the consequences of escalating the situation further. Or maybe on some level, she still believed that Mario could find peace and move on. Instead of pressing charges, she decided it was safer to leave her apartment temporarily. For a while, she lived with her sister, Carol, and later stayed with her longtime friend, Rita. Both women were alarmed by what Cecilia told them. They encouraged her, pleaded with her even, to go to the police and file a formal report. But Cecilia, despite her inner turmoil, continued to hold back. She expressed concern about the consequences for Mario and the stigma that might follow. In her mind, she was protecting him as much as she was trying to protect herself. After about a month of living away, Cecilia returned to her apartment in early April 2018. Though she had tried to reclaim some sense of normalcy, what she discovered upon returning unsettled her all over again. Small signs indicated that Mario had been in the apartment during her absence. The most disturbing realization came when she discovered that Mario still had a spare key. Neighbors later confirmed Cecilia's suspicions. Several residents had seen Mario loitering around the building, sometimes even standing near her apartment floor. When neighbors gently urged Cecilia to notify the authorities, she declined once again, insisting that she could manage things on her own. She believed, or perhaps hoped, that he would eventually tire and move on. For the next 2 weeks, Cecilia lived in a heightened state of anxiety. She avoided turning on lights at night, kept her movements quiet, and tried to appear as though she wasn't home. On the rare occasions she left the apartment, she did so cautiously, watching carefully for any sign of Mario. If she sensed even the slightest risk, she would stay with her sister or a friend instead. The psychological stress was overwhelming. Cecilia, once a confident and assertive woman, now lived in fear of the person she had once trusted most. Then, just as suddenly as things had spiraled, they seemed to settle. On April 25, 2018, Mario called Cecilia. His tone was calm, almost unusually so. He told her he had thought everything over and had come to terms with their separation. He apologized sincerely and said he understood that they needed to move on. He then mentioned that he had purchased a ticket to fly back to Rio de Janeiro and would be leaving early in the morning on April 28th. Before ending the call, he asked to see her one final time. He said he wanted a proper goodbye, one that would give both of them closure. Cecilia was hesitant but eventually agreed, on the condition that the meeting take place at the airport. She immediately called her sister Carol to relay the details of the conversation. Carol, sensing something wasn't right, urged her not to go. But Cecilia was firm in her decision. She told Carol that she needed to see Mario one last time to ensure he was truly leaving. The two sisters talked at length, with Carol making one final plea for her to reconsider. Cecilia reassured her, saying everything would be fine and promising to call as soon as Mario boarded the plane. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday, April 28th. Cecilia planned to be at Sydney International Airport by 7 a.m. to say her final goodbye before heading to an important business meeting. She was hopeful that this would mark the end of a painful chapter in her life. But the next day, something strange happened. Instead of receiving the promised phone call, Carol received a message from Cecilia, and that was when Carol's unease turned into alarm. In the message, Cecilia claimed that she needed a break from everything that had happened over the past few months. She wrote that she had decided to go to the mountains for a couple of days to clear her head and reflect on her future. She mentioned she wouldn't be reachable for a while and asked not to be disturbed. It didn't sit right with Carol or with anyone else who received a similar message. Carol's unease quickly turned to concern when she tried to call her sister back. The call went straight to voicemail. Cecilia's phone had already been turned off. Still, Carol tried to convince herself it might be nothing, that perhaps Cecilia really had needed some space after all the stress she had endured. However, multiple friends, clients, and colleagues began reporting that they too had received the same type of message from Cecilia, short, vague, and uncharacteristically formal. Even more troubling, she had failed to attend any of her scheduled meetings that day, including a highly anticipated business consultation with potential investors. This was completely unlike her. That evening, after attempting to contact her numerous times without success, Cecilia's loved ones could no longer ignore the sinking feeling. Carol, joined by Rita and a few close friends, went to the police to officially report Cecilia Hadad missing. They brought with them every detail they could provide: her recent movements, the names of people she had been in contact with, and most crucially, the identity of a man who had recently made her life incredibly difficult: Mario Santoro. But by the next morning, that faint hope was devastated when authorities contacted her family with tragic news. Carol was asked to come in to view and identify someone who matched Cecilia's description. On the morning of April 29, 2018, just a day after Cecilia had reportedly planned to meet Mario at the airport, a local man was out fishing on the Lane Cove River. While the spot was usually known for its quiet beauty, that day took a grim turn. The fisherman noticed something unusual floating near the shoreline. Disturbed by what he had found, he immediately contacted the local authorities. Police arrived quickly, and an investigation was launched on the scene. The woman found in the water had no form of identification on her. Her appearance suggested she was in her late 30s, and her clothes were carefully examined for clues. The lack of ID meant the initial priority for investigators was to identify who she was and determine what had led to her tragic fate. Detectives reviewed missing persons reports and found one that stood out. 38-year-old Cecilia Hadad, who had last been heard from on April 28th, and whose sister and friends had filed a missing persons report the previous evening. Comparing photographs and physical descriptions, the investigators quickly suspected the woman recovered from the river was Cecilia. Later that day, her family was brought in, and the worst was confirmed. Carol identified her sister. Detectives immediately launched a full-scale investigation. Their focus turned quickly to Mario Santoro, the ex-boyfriend who had been causing Cecilia distress for several months. The evidence began to mount quickly. Although Mario did not own a car of his own, he used Cecilia's vehicle. Investigators examined her car and discovered various fingerprints and signs that it had recently been used. Phone data became another critical point in the case. By tracing cell tower pings, police were able to map Mario's movements on the day Cecilia disappeared. The data revealed an unusual route, far from the typical path one would take to the airport. Additionally, traffic cameras showed Mario in several locations that lined up with the timeline of Cecilia's disappearance. A breakthrough came when authorities tracked down a taxi driver who had driven Mario to the airport. The driver recalled the ride clearly, not because Mario behaved erratically, but because of a strange request. The passenger had asked for an unexpected detour across a small bridge, spanning a quiet portion of the river. Once there, he exited the vehicle briefly, walked over to the edge, and was seen tossing a bag into the water. He also appeared to throw a smaller object, possibly keys, before returning to the taxi and continuing to the airport. The driver retraced the route with the police and brought them to the exact spot where the items had been discarded. Dive teams were immediately deployed to search the riverbed in that area. Fortunately, the water current was weak and visibility was decent. Within hours, the search team made a significant discovery. A large handbag submerged under the water, which contained Cecilia's mobile phone, her work laptop, personal documents, a wallet, and various items that confirmed the bag belonged to her. Not long afterward, the divers also recovered a set of house keys, believed to be the same ones Mario had retained without permission. Back at the command center, the full picture of what had happened was becoming disturbingly clear. Mario, after his final conversation with Cecilia, had never intended to board a flight out of Sydney as a simple farewell. Instead, it now appeared that his intentions were far more sinister. By the time Cecilia's body had been recovered, Mario was already thousands of miles away, having landed in Rio de Janeiro the day after the incident. He likely believed that by fleeing the country, he could escape scrutiny and avoid legal consequences. But the evidence collected by Australian authorities left no room for doubt. The digital footprints, forensic discoveries, and witness testimony formed a powerful case. With everything compiled, law enforcement contacted Interpol and formally issued a request for international assistance. Mario Santoro was now officially wanted for questioning in connection with a serious case. After nearly 2 months of investigation, coordination between agencies, and legal preparations, Brazilian law enforcement finally located Mario on July 7, 2018. He was found staying in a friend's apartment where he had kept a low profile, seemingly trying to avoid detection. He did not resist arrest and immediately asked for a lawyer. In initial interviews, Mario denied all involvement, presenting himself as a victim of circumstance. But the volume and weight of evidence told a different story. Witnesses testified to his controlling behavior. Messages and call logs demonstrated a pattern of harassment. The physical evidence placed him at the scene, and the contents recovered from the river left no doubt that he had gone to great lengths to erase his presence. Eventually, under the pressure of overwhelming facts and the emotional weight of the testimonies, Mario's story began to crumble. While he never provided a full confession, his shifting narratives and evasive statements did little to convince anyone of his innocence. According to the results of the extensive and meticulous investigation carried out by law enforcement, it became clear that by the time Mario Santoro booked his international flight, he had already formed a grim plan concerning his former partner, Cecilia Hadad. In the early hours of Saturday, April 28, 2018, at approximately 5:30 a.m., Mario arrived at Cecilia's apartment complex in the Sydney suburb where she lived. According to digital records, he rang the building's intercom, attempting to gain entry. Cecilia, expecting to meet him later that morning at the airport as they had discussed on the phone, was caught completely off guard by his sudden appearance. Given their recent history and the unease, she felt around him. She hesitated. She didn't immediately open the door, likely unsettled by this unplanned visit. However, what Cecilia did not know was that Mario had retained a duplicate set of keys to her building, keys she had believed were returned long ago. Using this spare key, he quietly let himself inside without causing a disturbance. Surveillance footage confirmed that no alarm was raised, and neighbors later reported hearing no suspicious sounds that morning, suggesting the encounter may have initially appeared calm, at least on the surface. It is believed that once Mario reached her apartment, he persuaded Cecilia to let him in, possibly under the pretense of wanting to talk before his flight. There was no sign of forced entry, and none of the neighbors reported any shouting or commotion, which further supported the theory that Cecilia may have opened the door voluntarily, still hoping the situation could be resolved peacefully. Unfortunately, that wasn't Mario's true intention. Investigators concluded that once inside, Mario carried out the next stage of his plan with disturbing precision. Rather than leaving for the airport, he instead drove Cecilia's vehicle toward a secluded area along the Lane Cove River, a quiet location not frequently visited during the early morning hours. There, he left her in a place he hoped would delay discovery, giving him a greater chance to flee the country without suspicion. But Mario's actions didn't stop there. After returning to Cecilia's apartment, he began to carefully erase traces of what had happened. He entered her home, took several of her personal items including her laptop, official documents, wallet, and mobile phone, and sent carefully crafted messages from her device. The texts were sent to her sister, close friends, and a few colleagues, all stating that she had made a spontaneous decision to retreat to the mountains for a few days to reflect and recharge. With that done, Mario placed her phone, along with the other items, into a bag. He later took this bag with him when he hailed a taxi to the airport. During the ride, Mario asked the taxi driver to make an unusual detour. He requested that they drive over a small, out-of-the-way bridge, far from the main roads and bustling airport routes. When they reached the quiet crossing, Mario briefly exited the vehicle, walked to the edge, and dropped the bag into the river. He also tossed in another object, believed to be the house keys he had used earlier. Then, as if nothing had happened, he returned to the taxi, completed the ride to the airport, and boarded his flight to Rio de Janeiro, calm and composed. From the outside, it appeared that Mario had executed a plan with clinical precision. By the time local authorities discovered Cecilia's body and pieced together the first stages of the investigation, Mario was already safely on another continent. Given that he was a Brazilian national and had returned to his home country, this posed a significant legal complication. Nevertheless, the gravity of the case, combined with the mounting evidence, prompted swift international cooperation. Australian authorities worked closely with Brazilian officials and legal experts to ensure that the case could be brought to justice, even if it meant conducting the proceedings in Mario's home country. Legal teams from both nations coordinated over the following months and years to ensure a fair but firm trial, despite the geographic challenges. After years of preparation, hearings, and evidence gathering, Mario Santoro's case finally went to trial in Brazil. The proceedings took into account all of the forensic and digital evidence collected by the Australian police, as well as the extensive witness statements provided by Cecilia's family, friends, and former colleagues. Testimonies painted a clear picture of a relationship that had turned tense, one where control and fear had steadily replaced love and respect. On July 1st, 2023, more than 5 years after Cecilia's untimely passing, the verdict was announced. The Brazilian court found Mario Santoro guilty of premeditated murder, as well as multiple related offenses, including tampering with evidence, obstructing justice, and attempting to mislead investigators. His actions were deemed calculated, manipulative, and deeply harmful, both to the victim and to the broader community who had been affected by the crime. Mario was sentenced to 27 years in prison with no possibility of parole. On the evening of November 28, 2008, as the last traces of daylight slipped behind the skyline and the city of Los Angeles began to glow with artificial lights, a sudden scream shattered the stillness of a downtown parking structure. Office workers who were just finishing their day and heading to their cars froze in shock. A few turned instinctively toward the source of the scream. One witness later recalled seeing a shadowy figure, a man rushing away from the area. The fading light and the distance made it difficult to make out any clear features, but his hurried, almost frantic movement was unmistakable. According to that witness, the man leapt into a red SUV parked not far from the scene. Without hesitation, the vehicle sped off, tires screeching against the pavement, vanishing before anyone could stop him or get a closer look. Only moments after the SUV disappeared, someone discovered a woman lying on the ground, motionless, near the spot where the vehicle had been. It was Pamela. Pamela Goody entered the world on August 31, 1963, in the peaceful city of Salt Lake City, Utah, a place nestled among the mountains and known for its close-knit communities. Born into a warm, supportive household, Pamela was one of 4 siblings. From an early age, she stood out for her kindness, radiant smile, and natural sense of leadership. After completing high school with excellent grades, she pursued higher education with a passion, eventually earning her college degree, a proud moment for both herself and her family. Shortly after graduating, Pamela entered a new chapter in her life. She met a man with whom she experienced the joys and challenges of a romantic relationship that, while fleeting, left a lasting legacy, the birth of her daughter, Desire. Though the relationship ultimately did not endure, Pamela embraced motherhood with unwavering strength and grace. Raising a child as a single parent is never easy, but Pamela met the task head-on, devoting herself entirely to Desire's well-being, education, and happiness. Those who knew Pamela during these years often described her as a beacon of positivity. Friends recalled how she had an uncanny ability to lift the mood of an entire room just by walking in. Her energy was magnetic, her presence calming. Beyond her personal qualities, Pamela also nurtured a strong sense of ambition. In 1989, she achieved a significant milestone by founding her own business in the competitive world of jewelry design and sales. Her eye for detail, combined with a passion for creativity, helped her brand stand out. She built the company from the ground up, overcoming numerous challenges along the way. Despite her professional success, Pamela's personal life remained a work in progress. For many years, she juggled the dual responsibilities of motherhood and entrepreneurship on her own. She was strong, no doubt, but also longed for companionship, someone who shared her values and would be a partner in both life and love. That person entered her life when she met James. James was a dedicated and skilled electrician, known for his reliability and work ethic. Like Pamela, he carried dreams of building something lasting, not just a career, but a family of his own. Their connection was immediate. There was an unmistakable spark between them, a sense of understanding that didn't need to be explained in words. Friends noticed the change in Pamela. Her smile grew a little brighter, her steps a little lighter. The couple's bond deepened quickly, their lives becoming intertwined in both subtle and significant ways. After a few years of dating, during which they supported each other's ambitions and created a shared vision for the future, Pamela and James decided to formalize their union. In 1998, they exchanged vows in a heartfelt ceremony in Las Vegas. However, the early years of their marriage were marked by hardship. Financial struggles soon emerged as a dark cloud over their seemingly bright union. The jewelry business that Pamela had worked so hard to build began to waver under economic pressures, while James juggled multiple contracts and projects to make ends meet. Things became even more complicated after the birth of their second child. The household expenses increased and the financial strain became overwhelming. Pamela had to make the difficult decision to seek government assistance in order to provide for her family. James, meanwhile, took on additional work, often accepting jobs that required him to travel for weeks at a time. His profession demanded long hours and frequent out-of-state assignments in order to meet client needs. It wasn't until 2002 that a significant turning point arrived for the couple. Faced with mounting challenges, they made a strategic decision to combine their efforts and start a new business venture together. They founded a company called Goldfinger, a business concept centered around the buying and selling of gold and other valuable items. Initially, they focused on acquiring gold jewelry and collectible coins, which they purchased from individuals looking for quick cash. They would later resell these items at a considerable markup, creating a lucrative revenue stream. This strategic move allowed them to accumulate capital and gradually scale their operations. Goldfinger operated in a way that resembled a pawn shop, though it was positioned more discreetly and catered to clients seeking short-term financial solutions. Customers would bring in their gold items and receive loans in exchange, with their valuables held as collateral. If the loan was repaid on time, the item would be returned to the client. If not, ownership of the gold transferred legally to Pamela and James. Around this time, global gold prices began to surge. By 2008, their stockpile of gold had appreciated significantly, turning their modest operation into a highly profitable enterprise. Their timing couldn't have been better, and the business flourished as a result. But with success came new tensions. Over time, cracks began to form in their marriage. James grew increasingly distant and detached, focusing more on the company's expansion and less on his relationship with Pamela. Simultaneously, James began to experience chronic health issues, including the onset of rheumatoid arthritis, a debilitating condition that made it difficult for him to maintain his demanding schedule and leadership responsibilities. As his health declined, Pamela gradually took on more of the administrative and strategic work to keep the company on track. In April 2007, a seemingly routine conversation would end up shifting the couple's dynamic in a significant way. While at the office, Pamela engaged in a discussion with an old friend named Carl, who operated a similar business in another part of the state. During their conversation, Pamela overheard something that troubled her deeply: the realization that they had never obtained the appropriate license for the type of financial transactions their company was conducting. Disturbed by the oversight, Pamela immediately resolved to correct the issue and ensure that their business complied with all state regulations. She saw this not only as a legal necessity, but also as a step toward long-term security for their company. That same year, on October 6th, Pamela received a check amounting to $400,000, a substantial sum earmarked specifically for covering the costs associated with licensing, legal fees, and mandatory state payments. Her decision to allocate this money toward legitimizing their operation did not sit well with James. From the outset, he dismissed the licensing efforts as a needless and expensive bureaucratic headache. He argued that their business had thrived without it thus far, and viewed Pamela's actions as an overreaction. But for Pamela, this wasn't just about paperwork. It was about protecting their livelihood and preventing future legal complications. This disagreement ignited long-standing tensions that had been quietly brewing beneath the surface. By October 2007, the situation had deteriorated beyond repair. After nearly a decade of marriage, James filed for divorce. The proceedings quickly turned adversarial. His objective became clear: to prevent her from completing the licensing process and to isolate her from any decision-making power within the company. The divorce proceedings between Pamela Goody and James Fayed soon spiraled into a heated and complex legal conflict that few could have anticipated. What began as a standard separation quickly escalated into a full-scale legal war, consuming not just their time and energy, but also their reputations and resources. The primary point of contention was their joint financial assets, specifically their company and shared bank accounts, which reportedly held more than $12 million at the time. Drawing on his legal team and exploiting every loophole available to him, he succeeded in having Pamela removed from any position of authority within the company they had built together. For Pamela, this was more than just a legal maneuver. It was a deeply personal blow. She had invested more than just money. She had given her time, her creative energy, and her trust. Her removal from the company not only stripped her of her role, but also erased her presence from the business that had once been her pride. Despite having been a wealthy woman not long before, Pamela now found herself in a precarious financial position. In order to continue fighting the legal battle, she had to borrow money just to afford the services of a competent legal team. This reversal of fortune, going from a multimillionaire entrepreneur to someone dependent on borrowed funds, was both humbling and heartbreaking. To make matters worse, James also took steps to sever Pamela's professional relationships. Pamela herself felt betrayed. She believed this campaign to discredit her was not only unnecessary but also deeply unethical. She had helped build Goldfinger from the ground up, contributing her expertise, connections, and tireless work ethic. In her eyes, this attempt to isolate her professionally was not just an attack on her business standing, but an attack on her identity. However, Pamela's challenges did not end with legal and financial issues. Not long after the divorce proceedings intensified, she learned that federal authorities had begun investigating Goldfinger for possible financial irregularities. Pamela was alarmed to discover that she herself was being scrutinized for potential fraud. The allegations came as a shock, particularly given her recent efforts to legitimize the business and obtain all necessary licenses. Fortunately, Pamela was ultimately cleared of any wrongdoing. The court reaffirmed her ownership stake in the company, acknowledging that her contributions had been both legitimate and substantial. For Pamela, it was a small but meaningful victory. After months of feeling powerless, she had reclaimed a part of what she had lost. But just as things appeared to be turning around, tragedy struck. On the evening of November 28, 2008, as daylight faded and the city's lights flickered on, a sudden and chilling scream pierced the calm of a parking structure in Los Angeles. Office workers, still leaving their jobs and heading to their cars, paused in alarm. One witness reported catching a glimpse of a man, his features obscured by the fading light and distance, who appeared to sprint away from the scene. The stranger jumped into a red SUV and sped off before anyone could intervene. Moments later, a woman was discovered lying on the ground near where the vehicle had been seen. It was Pamela. Although clearly injured, Pamela managed to pull herself up briefly. Witnesses recalled her turning toward one of the bystanders and pleading for help before collapsing again. Emergency services were quickly summoned. Police and medical personnel arrived at the scene within minutes. Paramedics provided immediate first aid and rushed her toward the nearest hospital. Despite their efforts, the injuries she sustained proved too severe. Tragically, Pamela passed away en route to the hospital. The Los Angeles Police Department immediately launched a full-scale investigation. Officers began interviewing the witness who had seen the fleeing vehicle, hoping to gather clues that might point to the identity of the assailant. Unfortunately, the witness was unable to offer a detailed description of the man, having only seen him for a few seconds. Still, security footage from the parking lot confirmed the witness's account. A red SUV had indeed exited the structure just moments after the scream was heard. Interestingly, there were no signs of theft. Pamela's handbag, jewelry, and other personal items were untouched. This led investigators to a chilling conclusion. The motive likely wasn't robbery. Rather, it seemed that Pamela had been specifically targeted. The deliberate nature of the act raised questions about who might have wanted to harm her and why. In homicide investigations, especially those involving prominent individuals, the people closest to the victim are often examined first. In this case, James Fayette became an immediate person of interest. Not only had he been embroiled in a bitter legal dispute with Pamela, but he also stood to benefit financially from her absence. On the day of her death, the former couple had met with their respective attorneys, still attempting to resolve their disagreements over business assets and ownership rights. The law office they visited was located in the very same building as the parking lot where Pamela was later found. According to detectives, after the legal meeting concluded, Pamela left the office alone and walked to her vehicle, which was parked on the third level of the parking structure. Investigators noted that James would have known her schedule and location that day. This detail was critical, as it could have provided both motive and opportunity. Some within the investigative team believed that this combination of knowledge and animosity pointed to James as a potential orchestrator of the attack. However, when questioned, James denied any involvement. He remained calm and composed throughout the interrogation, firmly maintaining that he had no role in what had happened. His legal team provided a strong alibi, supported by the presence of James at the law office during the relevant time, as well as video footage confirming his location. Additionally, his attorney and other witnesses attested to his whereabouts during the key window of time. Faced with these facts, investigators had no choice but to release him. All surveillance footage from the surrounding area, including internal garage cameras, external parking structure feeds, and nearby traffic cameras, was quickly collected and turned over to law enforcement authorities. This footage became a critical part of the investigation and allowed detectives to piece together a more complete timeline of events leading up to the tragic incident. One thing stood out almost immediately. Among the many people captured on video was James Fayette himself. After the meeting with attorneys earlier that day, he was seen calmly exiting the office building. What struck the detectives was how composed, almost unnaturally relaxed, James appeared, despite the surrounding chaos that had begun to unfold after Pamela's scream. Witnesses in the area were startled and visibly shaken, and several had rushed to see what had happened. Yet James, who had only recently concluded a tense legal discussion with his former spouse, walked away with what investigators described as an eerily unaffected demeanor. Detectives noted that such behavior can sometimes indicate foreknowledge, an understanding of what was about to occur, leading to a conscious decision to avoid being present during the discovery of the incident. Though not definitive evidence on its own, it was enough to keep James firmly in the crosshairs of the ongoing investigation. As police continued to review the footage frame by frame, a clearer picture of the actual attack began to emerge. Pamela had left the building and was walking toward her vehicle, which was parked on the third floor of the structure. From the angle of the footage, investigators could see that a red SUV, the same vehicle mentioned by witnesses, had been slowly circling the upper levels of the parking lot minutes before Pamela arrived. It then stopped in a nearby row, almost as if lying in wait. As Pamela approached her car and reached into her purse for the keys, the SUV moved abruptly and came to a stop in a position that appeared to block her in. At that precise moment, a figure leaped from the back seat and moved swiftly toward her. Though the actual assault was not clearly captured due to camera angles, the speed and precision of the person's movements suggested that the act was carefully planned. Pamela had been watched, tracked, and intercepted. From there, investigators shifted their focus to the vehicle itself. By tracking the license plate, they discovered that the SUV had been rented just 2 days earlier from a well-known car rental company located near downtown Los Angeles. The rental agreement provided law enforcement with a new set of leads. Once the vehicle was located and secured, forensic teams carried out an extensive analysis of the interior. They searched for fingerprints, hair, fabric fibers, and any other trace materials that could offer clues. Their diligence paid off. In the narrow seams of the rear seat upholstery, forensic specialists discovered a small amount of DNA evidence, most likely left behind by someone who had recently crouched or moved quickly through the area. Even more promising, surveillance cameras in and around the parking garage had captured clear images of 3 individuals who had either entered or exited the SUV at various times. The clarity of the images allowed authorities to run facial recognition comparisons and eventually match them with names in law enforcement databases. The trio identified were Jose Moya, Gabriel Marquez, and Stephen Moya. Of the 3, Jose Moya stood out immediately. He was not just a random individual with a criminal background. He had long-standing personal ties to both James and Pamela. For several years, Jose had worked on the Fayette family's private estate, helping to maintain the ranch and managing various domestic tasks. He was known to the family and had even attended several private events hosted by the couple. When investigators compared the attacker's silhouette and physical build captured on camera with photographs of Jose, the resemblance was striking. This, combined with his known association with the Fayette family, elevated Jose from a person of interest to a prime suspect. With appropriate legal clearance, they accessed cell phone records, GPS logs, and call histories. The results were revealing. Data indicated that both Gabriel and Stephen's mobile devices had pinged off a cell tower located just 100 meters from the parking structure at the approximate time of the incident. These devices had not only been in the vicinity, they had remained there for a significant window of time before and after the event. These details, when considered alongside the forensic evidence and surveillance footage, painted a picture of a coordinated operation. Each new piece of data added to the growing stack of evidence that suggested this was more than just a crime of passion. It was a calculated attempt to remove someone who had become a threat to certain interests. As the net tightened around the trio, federal agencies began to take interest. Once news of the attack intersected with an ongoing financial investigation into the Goldfinger Company, both the FBI and Internal Revenue Service formally joined the case. What they uncovered added a whole new dimension to the story. Authorities discovered that the Fayed family business had been operating through a web of shell companies and front organizations, one of which was deeply entangled in a suspected money laundering operation. The scale of the operation was significant. Millions of dollars were being cycled through fake invoices, sham transactions, and off-the-book sales, eventually being laundered through a partner company with international reach. 2 fraudulent financial schemes were uncovered in the process, one involving inflated asset valuations to acquire illicit loans, and another that used gold purchases to obscure the origin of funds. In hindsight, Pamela's push to obtain official licensing for Goldfinger in 2007, an act that had caused so much friction with James, made perfect sense. She had unknowingly stumbled into a dangerous world of concealed accounts and false record. The spotlight also returned to Jose Moya. The investigation assumed that he had infiltrated the family of the wealthy couple for a reason, but he categorically denied that he had any involvement at all. In order to put this man behind bars for a long time, much more was needed than just surveillance camera footage. James was soon charged with conducting illegal financial operations, a serious white-collar offense that carried substantial prison time. It turned out that Pamela's actions in the months leading up to the incident were no coincidence. Her sudden interest in obtaining proper licensing and paying outstanding business fees had a deeper motive. Unbeknownst to many, Pamela had already been contacted by the FBI shortly before her death. The timing of this contact proved crucial. It was during these initial meetings with federal agents that Pamela learned the disturbing truth about her husband's activities. Years of financial records and business dealings were beginning to show signs of fraudulent activity, implicating James in schemes that funneled illicit money through the family business. Pamela, committed to doing the right thing, had agreed to cooperate with federal investigators. She was preparing to hand over a trove of documents and evidence during a planned meeting. Evidence that could have permanently dismantled James's operation and led to a cascade of legal consequences. According to federal agents, they had no doubt that James had discovered her cooperation. Whether through intercepted communications or subtle behavioral changes, it became evident to him that his former spouse was about to expose everything. That realization, they believed, may have led him to the conclusion that she had to be silenced before she could jeopardize everything he had built. August 1st, 2008, James Fayed, then 45 years old, was arrested at his sprawling ranch. The operation was conducted early in the morning by FBI agents who had obtained an arrest warrant based on the financial evidence they had compiled. James appeared stunned by the presence of law enforcement, though he remained composed as agents read him the list of charges. Without resistance, he requested his attorney and was taken into federal custody. In the days that followed, James continued to assert his innocence, dismissing the charges as exaggerated or misconstrued. Internal records, witness statements, and bank transfers all pointed to James as the mastermind behind the misuse of funds. Not long after his arrest for financial crimes, James was also formally charged with orchestrating the murder of his ex-wife. However, this charge proved harder to substantiate. Despite strong suspicions and circumstantial evidence, direct proof linking him to the planning of the crime was elusive. Phone records and digital correspondence among the suspected participants had been carefully deleted. Then, in a surprising turn of events, an unexpected opportunity arose from within the very jail where James was being held. One of his cellmates, a man named Smith, came forward to share concerns about James's behavior. Smith claimed that although James was polite and charismatic, he often made veiled references to problems that would go away soon and hinted that people sometimes had to take care of things themselves. Detectives saw potential in this. With Smith's cooperation and under legal authorization, they arranged for him to wear a concealed listening device in hopes of capturing an unguarded confession. In exchange, Smith hoped for a reduced sentence in his own pending case. The very same evening, he returned to the shared cell and struck up a deep personal conversation with James. Over the course of the recorded exchange, James made a chilling admission. Believing Smith to be trustworthy, he opened up about what had really happened. He explained how he had enlisted Jose Moya, a former employee and someone who had been around the Fayed estate for years, to carry out the attack. James admitted to offering Moya $225,000 for the job, a sum large enough to ensure cooperation and silence. But what was perhaps even more alarming was what James said next. He revealed that once the crime had been committed, his next step was to eliminate Moya himself. His plan had been to hire a second individual to permanently silence the first, thus removing the one person who could connect him to the murder. This second hit was never carried out, but the intent alone demonstrated the level of calculation involved. Further investigation revealed that Jose Moya had not acted alone. He had later involved two other individuals, Gabriel Marquez and Stephen Moya, to assist him. Surveillance footage from the parking lot, which had been thoroughly analyzed months earlier, showed all three men together in the red SUV, confirming their involvement at the scene. Authorities concluded that Jose was likely the primary attacker, while the other two were there to provide backup and ensure the plan's success. The complexity of the case, combined with the layers of financial and criminal charges, meant that the prosecution required nearly 3 years to prepare for trial. Dozens of witnesses were interviewed, records were reconstructed, and expert testimonies were gathered to paint a full picture of the events. One of the more surprising witnesses was James's own sister, Mary Fayed. Ultimately, the district attorney's office was able to secure a conviction. With overwhelming evidence, including the secret recording from jail, the financial trail, and testimonies from those close to the defendant, the jury delivered a unanimous verdict. James Fayed was found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. In a final ruling that marked the end of a long and complex case, the judge sentenced James to death, describing his actions as those of a person who had manipulated, deceived, and destroyed lives for personal gain. Jose Moya, along with his two accomplices, was found guilty of carrying out a contract killing. All three were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.